Hello everyone. Today we're going to look at Jquery.ime from the Wikimedia Foundation. Jquery.ime is an input method written in JavaScript. It's part of Project Milkshake from MediaWiki. Say that you needed to input text within a language that used some characters outside of the range of ASCII, such as Esperanto, and you wanted to do a search for stone. The input method here allowed me to type, let's do this again, S, then X, which converted it to an S with a circumflex accent, and then the rest of the word. This is known as the X system for Esperanto, and it allows you to type out Esperanto easily on a standard US keyboard. I came across the Jquery Ime project because I am creating an input method myself, and rather than write one for OS X and Linux and Windows, I thought surely an input method editor could be written for the web. And sure enough, it's been done, and this plugin in particular has implemented something like 50 input methods already. Now, as usual, let's get started by checking out the source code. Git clone. And let's take a look at it inside of Emacs. Sandbox jquery.ime. And why don't we start by taking a look at the example it includes here in examples. Firefox, jquery.ime, examples, index.html. And here it is, the demo. Now this works exactly like the input on translatewiki.net. We can choose our language. So again, Esperanto. And something has happened. The X after the S hasn't worked. So the first thing I do in a situation like this is open up Firebug and take a look at the console to see if there are any errors. Okay, let's try again. Nothing. Well, let's see. We need to switch it to Esperanto. And there's an exception. Access to restricted URL denied. What this means is that Firefox's security policy is preventing something from loading. Error in loading input method EO transliteration. And the error is coming from line 303 of jquery.ime.js, so let's take a look at that. Line 303, and well, that's the debug function. So this was probably registered as an exception or failure handler. So let's see, there it is. So an Ajax call, a jQuery Ajax call failed to load and called debug to notify us of what the exception is in the console. So why is the exception happening? If you've worked with JavaScript long enough, you've probably already seen this. Most browsers don't allow access to file URLs for security reasons. Now we'd really like to continue with the demo, so to get around this we can just set up a local web server to serve the files, and then Firefox shouldn't complain anymore. You can use whatever server you want. There's one that's pretty lightweight for Linux, WebFSD. I'll run it in the foreground. And it listens by default on localhost on port 8000. So localhost 8000. And it's now serving this directory, so let's look in examples at index.html. Again, select Esperanto as the input language. And let's try now. and it works. Well, that's great. We can input Esperanto, but most operating systems have ways for inputting accented characters pretty easily. So let's try something a little bit more complex. We'll take a look at the International Phonetic Alphabet and try entering code deconstructed in it. Now, I had to look this up beforehand because I don't know the International Phonetic Alphabet by heart, nor do I know the input method. Let's see, code deconstructed. And there it is. If you look through the list of supported input methods from this plugin, you'll find Hindi, Arabic, and some lesser known languages that may not have input methods existing for some of the major operating systems. So I think this is pretty cool. Without having to install any software, you can make, for example, Wikipedia accessible to more people throughout the world. And I don't think the usefulness stops there. There are probably some interesting ideas and techniques inside of this code that can be applied to other projects where you're dealing with user input. Or if you want to write a jQuery plugin. So let's dive into the source code. We're in jQuery.ime, which seems like the most likely place to find the entry point to this program. Starting from the top, you'll see an anonymous function that takes a parameter $, and you may be familiar with this already. This is a way of accepting the jQuery object without assuming that it's assigned to $, already, and using an anonymous function to make sure that you don't pollute the global namespace in JavaScript. The next line, use strict, is relatively new. This is similar to Perl's strict mode, and it's going to be a feature of the upcoming ECMAScript, I think version 5. Now we could continue going through this line by line, but I like to see where things start. So let's take a look at the example source code and see what it's doing. So it's setting up a document ready function. Then it's finding all inputs and text areas and calling .ime on them. If you've written a jQuery plugin before, you'll know exactly what this means for the code. If not, what we're looking for is $.fn for function, presumably, .ime. This is what will be called when a page calls .ime on some elements that are matched by a jQuery selector. The first thing this function does is a little bit strange. It returns this.each run with another function. This is standard jQuery plugin code. What's happening is that this is assigned to all of the elements that matched the selector. If we look back at index.html, every input and text area will be passed in a jQuery object this. Each is used to iterate over each of those objects with the given function. Inside the function, this is assigned to the jQuery version of this because jQuery's each sets this to the element, the raw element, not the jQuery version of the element for each iteration. And so this is wrapping the element as a jQuery object once so that the rest of the function can use it. This next line, options equals type of option equals object, and option is a little bit strange, but it's checking that the option is an object, and if so, setting options to it. This type of check is here so that at the end of this function, if the option was a string, it could be called as a function. And I don't really agree with this type of design. It's a little bit confusing when a parameter to a function can be of a different type that ends up invoking different code. So we'll just ignore that for now. Next, it looks to make sure that the element under consideration doesn't have a read-only property or isn't disabled or doesn't have the class no IME, which is a nice way of allowing a page that's using this plugin to declare that an input shouldn't be touched by it. Next, it's assigning to the data variable this.data IME. .data is a jQuery function that returns the data value for a jQuery element. If the data is not found on the element, then a new IME object is instantiated and the data is set to that element. Before we go deeper into the code, let's actually take a look at this inside of Firebug. So we'll enable Firebug, and I'm going to set a breakpoint, so I need to reload the page and switch to, let's see, ime.js, and we were on line 270. So scroll down to it and set a breakpoint here. Let's reload the page. And now we're stopped and we can see what data is. And let's take a look at this. So data is an IME object that has these properties here. And that's the end of that function. The return is here to allow jQuery chaining, so that anytime you call a jQuery function on a jQuery object, you get the jQuery object back so that you can call another jQuery function on that, and so on. If you forget to do this and instead just call this.each, your plugin will work, but someone using it may get confused and frustrated when they can't chain methods off of your plugin. So now we've seen all the jQuery boilerplate code. Let's actually take a look at this new IME object. So IME is here at the top. So IME here is a function, but one that's intended to be called with the new keyword. When you call a function with new in JavaScript, that creates a new blank object that's then assigned to this inside the context of the function. So IME here is a constructor. Each of these this.whatever assignments are assigning values to the IME object. IME is called with two arguments, element and options. The first is the input element that we are enhancing with the input methods, and the value $element is assigned to the jQuery version of that element. The next assignment is a little bit strange, and you can see from the comment here, it's actually a bit of a hack that couldn't be done anywhere else because this needed to be done after DOM ready. My guess for why this is here is that there's no way to control the order that DOM ready events are fired in. And since there's multiple scripts that are loaded on the page, each may have their own DOM ready events, and we can't be certain of which order they're fired in. The code is waiting for some inputs to get transformed before it does this part. This line has nothing to do with the constructor itself. You can see that it's not using this keyword. Next, some options are being extended. Extend is a jQuery function you may be familiar with, or you'll get familiar with over time, which allows you to take two objects and sort of merge them. In this line, it's taking the defaults and merging in the options from the second argument. Then some default values are set here, and a new selector is created, which we'll look at later. And then this.listen is called. So the constructor here has set what you may call member variables. It's set properties on the newly constructed IME object. But there's no methods, and that's what these following lines are for. IME.prototype sets the properties of all IME objects that will be constructed or created later. First, the constructor is set to IME. That's the function above. This line isn't really necessary in JavaScript unless the code expects to find it. What's happening is that the IME function, by default, when called with new, the constructor property will be set to the function itself, IME. But since ime.prototype is being set to an object instead of something like ime.prototype.listen equals and a list of these assignments, it's all being set to an object here, it would overwrite the constructor, and so they've set it back to what it was before. Then there's a list of functions here, listen, transliterate, keypress, and so on, which are the methods for this object, and they'll be shared between all instances of IME objects. This may be very familiar to some of you, and if it's not, there's a lot of sites that explain JavaScript's OOP style of prototype or prototypical inheritance. For our purposes, all we need to know is that there are some values on this object and some functions or methods that we can call on it. And that listen is called during the construction of an IME, which is this function here. So listen accesses the element that was assigned in the constructor, calls on, which is an event handler, keypress.ime. If you look for keypress.ime in the source code, this is the only line that it will exist on. It's actually just the keypress event. The .ime is a feature that jQuery adds where it allows you to add a dot whatever to the end of an event so that you can bind the event with a specific name in case you want to remove the event later without removing all of the event handlers that have been set on it. So it binds the keypress event to this jQuery proxy function for this keypress, this. And proxy is a way of calling a function and setting the context for it. So it's going to call the keypress method on this object with the context set to this, which for jQuery on an event binding is going to be the element itself. Let's take a look at keypress, which is here. The keypress function receives one argument, e, which is an event object that gives us information about the event. And a lot of this function is handling things that we don't want to get into too much detail in. Let's see where the actual work happens down here. First, C is assigned the value of the character code from the event object, so the actual printed character, and you can see above that control characters are handled separately. Next, the code gets the caret position, which is a subject in and of itself because it's a little bit difficult to do correctly on different browsers. The caret position is in case there is a selection or the cursor is in between two characters. You wouldn't want to assume that the cursor is always at the end of the line that you're typing. Then it does some more work here that we're going to gloss over for now. Finally, it calls this.transliterate, the input, given a context, and Alt-GR, which is whether or not the group key is pressed or the Alt key. And transliterate was above. And this function's a little bit confusing to look at without some context. So let's return to the International Phonetic Alphabet example here. And I have a script that is waiting on a breakpoint, so let's just finish that. And you may remember that I had to look up the IPA spelling for code deconstructed, but how did I figure out how to input it? This actually goes back to the error we received in the beginning about needing to include a file at execution time for the input method itself. If we look in the source, there's a rules directory which has a list of rules for the different languages covered, and IPA is not under a language code because it's not a language and it doesn't have one, but this is the SIL IPA input method. And you can see the list of patterns here. So in order to type the special U symbol used in code, I looked it up on the right here, and let's see if I can remember where it was. And there it is, right there. So it's U followed by the less than symbol. Now, what I always like to see in a file like this is that it's very declarative. There's not any code anywhere, and so it looks like it would be pretty easy to add new input methods, and this is probably why there's been 50 implemented so far, or at least one of the reasons. So you might start to have an inkling of what's going on in the transliterate function. There's these patterns here, and transliterate, if we can go back to it, is looking through the patterns given the input and the context and making replacements. Now, I'd like to go into more detail of how this transliterate function is working, but slogging through code line after line in one sitting can get a little bit boring and tiresome. So let's take a step back and review how we got here inside of Firefox, and hopefully that gives us another perspective on it so that we'll be better prepared to go deeper. And then after that, I have an idea for a small project that could be pretty useful to do with Jquery Ime. So I had set a breakpoint before, and I'm going to set one again a little bit higher this time in the code and reload the page so that we can look through what's happening. So we've gotten to the point where the input comma text area, let's point out what I mean. Actually, I can't right now because the script is paused, so switch into the code. This input.textArea, input comma text area dot ime has been called, and we are now in the function defined here. And I mentioned that this is going to be set to the jQuery object containing these inputs. And you can see it here. This is an input and a text area. There's only two on the page. And you can take a look at these. This is the input. This is the text area. This may display differently for you if you don't have Firequery installed. Firequery is an extension that builds on top of Firebug for Firefox that displays jQuery objects in a slightly nicer syntax and allows us to get at data and some other things. So next, let's step into what this each is doing. Actually, we don't want to see what it's doing inside of jQuery itself, so we'll step out of it and we'll step over this line. And I've managed to step myself right out of the program. So let's continue and reload and try it again. So instead of trying to step to this, we can go ahead and set another breakpoint and continue to it. And actually, we'd like to get down to here. So I'm going to clear this breakpoint and move to the next one. And this is the data call on the IME, which is undefined here because there's no data set on these inputs. They're just, let's see, plain HTML here. So if we step through this, we've constructed a new IME here once Firebug returns control to us, and we should be able to see that in the next line. Now data is an IME object, and we're going to set the data attribute for the jQuery object to that. And I was mentioning earlier that Firequery allows you to see the data assigned to an object that wouldn't normally be visible in the DOM, and maybe I can show you that in a second. But first, let's clear these breakpoints I've added and go to the listen handler, or rather the key press handler, to see what we actually get here. So we can continue the script, reload the page, and I haven't set the breakpoint at the correct spot. This is actually the assignment step here. So let's set the breakpoint here, clear this breakpoint, continue. And now as soon as we press a key, I'll press space, we'll hit this breakpoint and we can examine the event object. We can look at things like the character code. And if we look in the source for key press, if the character code is less than 32, well, the character code here is 32, so we should get to this C being set to the space character. Let's see if that happens. Right about, we'll break here. And it didn't, so something else is going on. Let's try pressing a different key this time. Let's try pressing A, and we'll continue. And this is strange. What's going on here? Let's try setting another breakpoint and see if we make it even past this first check. So we'll type B. We made it to the first breakpoint, and we didn't make it to the second. So it seems that the input isn't active. And if you actually look through the code, what's going on is that when this input is losing focus, in between when we press a key and when we are inside of Firebug, the input is losing focus and active is no longer set, so the plugin thinks that it shouldn't do anything. This is one of the joys of debugging code. Sometimes just the act of debugging the code will change its behavior. Well, we know that we just want to see what's going on here, so let's go ahead and set the value of this.active to true so that the code will continue. And let's make sure that we have a breakpoint where we want it still. Yes. So we no longer need this breakpoint, and we should make it to our next breakpoint, but we didn't again. So let's see why not. Okay, after a quick look at the code, I noticed there is a if not this input method check right where we had the breakpoint set before. That won't be set on the reload of a page because the inputs default back to the system input method. So we'll set it to Esperanto again. Enter another key, this time we'll do D. Again, we will set active to true, which it is here, and continue. And now we've made it to our breakpoint, and we can take a look at what C is. And here it is D. Let's take a break from looking at the code for a minute and see if we can use what we've learned for implementing an input method of our own. I'm going to clear the breakpoints here. And since I don't have any foreign languages or scripts in mind to implement, what about making Japanese emoticons easier to input? If you haven't seen what I mean, let's take a look. Japanese emoticons. And let's try the first site here, Japanese emoticons. Let's look at happy emoticons first. Now there's a lot of emoticons to choose from, but I'll just pick one for illustration. And it looks like rosy cheeks. And we'll create a new input method. So let's take a look at the rules directory and copy the Esperanto directory to, let's just say, Jmotes. We'll do a recursive copy. And now we'll rename this to Jmotes transliteration.js. And you can see here that the format of the Esperanto transliteration won't work for us because it's a loop that uses a regular syntax to add the X's to the patterns. So let's go ahead and write the rules out ourselves. And for reference, we can look at the IPA rules. And the patterns are the pattern we're looking for and the replacement. So why don't we go ahead and call that Rosie. And to signify that it's a remote, we could begin with a colon character. And this is going to be a pair. And then we can paste the emote that we copied. And now we don't need these anymore, or this function. And I'm not going to bother changing any of the information on this except for possibly the ID in case it's, well, let's see, Japanese emoticons. Can fix this later. And we'll change the name of this function, or yeah, this object to Japanese, or Jemotes, and the register to Jemotes. And now let's switch back and see if we can test this. Reload the page and clear this out. Let's actually use this input and look for Japanese emoticons. Let's close Firebug to give us a little bit more space. And I don't see it in the list here, which makes sense because how would the JavaScript know what exists on the file system or on the web server? So there's probably a registry for these. Let's take a look in the source, Jquery Ime input methods. Sounds promising. And here it is. So let's look for the Esperanto transliteration and copy it in as Jemotes. And the rules was Jemotes. Double check that that's correct. And we'll try that again. So reload. And we'll see if we have Japanese emoticons. We don't, so let's try force reload with shift reload. And looking through the list, still no Japanese emotes. Okay, after some brief searching through the source, turns out you have to register the new input method in 2 locations, in the input methods and in the languages. So we don't actually have a language here, but we'll just use one like the IPA method right after the Esperanto one. We'll call it Jemotes, Japanese emoticons, and Jemotes transliteration. And now hopefully this time everything works. And there they are, Japanese emoticons. I'll close Firebug so we get a little bit more space. And typing normally works, and Rosie doesn't. You may have guessed at the reason already, looking at the input method. Let's try bumping the context length and max key length to 5. Forcing a reload. And set to Japanese emoticons again. There we go. I've been having a lot of fun with this code up until now, but there's only so much you can do on pages you've created yourself. Wouldn't it be nice to have a bookmarklet that you could use on any page you're visiting to convert the inputs to ones that have these input methods for you? So, for example, if you're editing a Wikipedia page for the Esperanto Wikipedia, you could input in Esperanto using the X system. Or if you were on a website for chat and you wanted to have a list of Japanese emoticons ready to go, you could use your new input method on that site. Well, the episode's already gotten quite long, but we'll do that and more in the next episode. I'll see you then.